Hello and welcome to this chess endgame review on schematic thinking. And some of you may ask, well, what is schematic thinking? Well, schematic thinking is different from the I go here, he goes there, and then I'll go here thought process. In schematic thinking, you look at a position on the board, such as this one here, and you try to think by asking yourself where would be the best position for my pieces and pawns, kind of like your dream position. And then you go ahead and calculate, trying to figure out how to get your pieces and pawns into that position. And so here it is White's turn to move. What would you do in this position? What plan would you come up with if you were White to move in this position? Think about that and pause the video if you need to. If not, I will turn on the analysis and we will see what White decides in this position. Okay, here White has used schematic thinking to decide that he would like to put his bishop down here where the knight is. And from there, it could keep the c pawn from promoting and also stop this f pawn from pushing forward. And he would like to get his knight up here to f4 to blockade this pawn and also to help box out the black king in this position and keep the black king away from White's h-pawn here. And he would also like to push this h-pawn up to h4, and the knight and pawn will work together to keep this king kind of trapped and boxed away from the action here on the king side. And so now White has to calculate how to go about doing this. So first White decides to play bishop to f4 to get on this line where he will back this bishop up down here to c1 after the knight moves. But also this bishop move keeps the king away from trying to get into the center of the board. But black moves forward attacking this pawn, and so of course White protects it. And now Black is kind of running out of moves. He just moves his bishop back and forth and kind of waits to see what White will do. But White has his plan of trying to get the knight up here to f4, the bishop down here to c1, and push this pawn forward to h4. And now, in this position, bishop to c4 was played here, but another possibility could be this, bishop to c6, and then after knight to e5 attacking the bishop would move here to guard these pawns, and the game may proceed with finally the white bishop going to c1 as planned. And now black kind of running out of moves, so he just retreats the bishop to see what white will do. And now check with the knight. King moves and the knight jumps into this position here, and this would allow the king to move back, and then the bishop move by white here just to force black to move. And if the king moved here, the white king would be able to press forward and then push his pawn up to h4 as planned. So this is one possibility that could play out. But in the main line, after knight to d3, the bishop attacks the knight, and then we have a knight retreat. The bishop moves to protect this pawn that the knight is attacking, and so the knight continues to move up closer to this f4 square, and also it chases the king away. So the king moves back. White comes up into the position to help escort his pawn to h4 here. And the bishop attacks the knight, but not really wanting to trade off pieces as he is behind. And so the knight moves up, and from here the knight will be able to go either to e6 or e2, and then jump into this f4 square, which is his destination. So once again, black just moves his bishop back and forth, kind of limited on his options. And finally, the bishop moves down to his target destination, c1, where he can blockade the c pawn and keep an eye on this f pawn. And once again, black's bishop just moves. And finally, here, after an attack on the knight goes to his destination on f4. And we see the king is under attack, cannot move forward now, and the knight limits the g6 square, keeping that out or away from black, limiting him on his moves. So here the king just moves toward the center, but black's king wants to keep an eye on this pawn. And so finally the pawn is pushed forward to h4 here, and black must retreat. So white, using schematic thinking, has achieved his ideal setup here. And we see what this does. Having the knight here, it covers these squares on h5 and g6, and the pawn works with the knight to cover g5. So now the king cannot move forward and put any pressure on this pawn. And white will just keep his pawn here, as if he did move forward, that would allow black to move to g5 and come in contact with the pawn. The pawn could be weaker if it moved forward. So pawn and knight will stay here. The bishop will keep an eye on the c pawn, the square in front of it, to keep it from moving. And then we have the bishop just moving up here, also cutting off the black king. And now in this position, we see another opportunity for schematic thinking. So if white were able to move his king all the way up to h8, it would allow a bishop to g7 checkmate opportunity. And so that is the dream position that white would like to achieve next, if black allows him. And so white will aim for that position, a possible checkmate threat. And now black continues just moving his bishop back and forth, limited on moves, and the king begins his journey to attempt to move all the way up above the black king and threaten a mate. So the bishop is just moving back and forth. The king continues his journey, and the bishop is just trying to keep an eye on the position, but white is slowly making progress. And here black has maybe one last chance. He moved bishop to c8, but if king to h7 had been played, then the possibility of this scenario playing out and then in this position we would have a king, knight, and bishop endgame. White would be able to come down here and pick this pawn off, and the endgame would be king, knight, and bishop versus king, which is a checkmate possibility, but it is a long and rather difficult way to checkmate somebody, especially if you haven't had practice in this. So in normal club player games, this would probably run into the 50 move rule if somebody wasn't familiar how to checkmate with somebody. So maybe that was black's last opportunity. But instead, after king to f7, instead of king to h7, bishop to c8 was played. And now white will reach his desired position. White does not want to capture this bishop. Instead, white will move to king to h8 here. And the game is over after whatever black plays. Let's say he promotes to a queen here, but bishop to g7 would be mate here. So an interesting demonstration of the use of schematic thinking, where once again you look at a position, and instead of thinking, well, if I go here, he goes there, I'll go here, you think in a different way, where you look at the position and ask yourself, where would be the best squares for my pawns and my pieces? And then you calculate, trying to figure out how to achieve that setup, how you would be able to maneuver your pieces and pawns to those squares. So I invite you to try and use this schematic thinking to help come up with plans in your chess games, and hopefully play a better endgame than your opponent and help you win. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.